Picture this: a massive log, thick as a dinner table, slowly grinding through an ancient blade. The saw moves back and forth, powered by nothing but falling water. No electricity, no diesel, just gravity, an engineering genius from another era. Now imagine standing in that same mill today. You flip a switch, an electric saw screams to life and tears through that log in seconds. Done. The contrast is almost violent. But here's what makes this story strange. We're talking about the 1920s here, Jazz Age. Ford Model Ts rolling off assembly lines. Radio broadcasts crackling through living rooms across America. The modern world is being born. And yet, deep in the forests of Norway, Maine, and Oregon, they're still cutting lumber the way people did in medieval times. With water wheels. How does that even work? How can water, just water falling from above, generate enough raw power to slice through a meter-thick oak log? And here's the bigger mystery. Why did this technology, which had dominated for centuries, vanish almost overnight? The stakes were enormous. We're not talking about a few hobbyists. Millions of people worked in this industry. Entire towns existed because of a single water-powered mill. Families, livelihoods, generations of knowledge, all built around these massive wooden wheels turning in the current. And then, in less than a decade, it was over. The wheels stopped. The mills went silent. An entire way of life drowned in the flood of progress. So let's go back to those final years when water still ruled the forests, back to a world that was already dying but didn't know it yet. Let's talk about the engineering beauty hidden in these mills, because when you actually understand how they worked, it's almost supernatural. First, forget everything you think you know about water wheels. Most people imagine some rustic paddle wheel spinning in a babbling brook. Charming but weak. That's not what powered industrial lumber production. The real machines use something called an overshot wheel. Water didn't push the wheel from below. It fell from above, landing in massive wooden buckets mounted around the wheel's circumference. And here's the key. It wasn't the speed of the water that mattered. It was the weight, pure gravitational force. Think about it. Each bucket fills with hundreds of pounds of water. Gravity pulls it down. The wheel rotates. The bucket empties at the bottom. Another bucket fills at the top. Over and over, relentless, efficient, elegant. But that's just the beginning. That rotating wheel connects to a central shaft, and we're not talking about some thin metal rod. This is a hand-hewn oak beam, 4.5 meters long, carved by master craftsmen. It has to be. The torque is phenomenal. Lesser materials would snap like toothpicks. From that main shaft, the power flows through a cascade of gears. Large wooden cogwheels mesh with smaller ones, transforming the wheel's slow, powerful rotation into the rapid back and forth motion the saw needs. It's a symphony of mechanical advantage, each gear precisely calculated. And then comes the genius part, the part most people never see. The saw itself doesn't just cut. It cuts in a rhythm, synchronized with a moving carriage. The log sits on this carriage, which is also powered by the water wheel through a separate mechanism. As the saw blade moves forward through the wood, the carriage advances the log millimeter by millimeter. When the saw pulls back, the carriage pushes the log forward again. Cut, advance, cut, advance. But wait, there's more preparation involved than you'd think. Those logs don't go straight from forest to saw. They spend days, sometimes weeks, soaking in specially constructed mill ponds. The wood fibers absorb water, swell, soften. The grain structure changes. This isn't just convenience, it's essential. Waterlogged wood cuts cleaner, resists splitting, and puts less strain on the blade. When it's time, chains, also powered by the wheel, drag the massive logs from the pond into the mill building. Workers guide them onto the carriage, securing them with iron dogs and wedges. Everything is timed, everything is connected. One water wheel, falling water, and suddenly you've got this intricate ballet of wood, iron, and force. The whole system operates with maybe 70 to 80% efficiency. Not bad for technology that traces back to the Roman Empire. Actually, Not bad compared to early steam engines either, which is partly why these mills survive so long. But here's what gets me. Stand inside one of these mills when it's running, if you can find one still operating, and the sound is hypnotic. The steady slosh of water hitting the wheel, the rhythmic screech of the saw biting wood, the creak of timber and rope under strain. It's industrial, yes, but there's an organic quality to it, a natural rhythm you can feel in your chest. Humans figured this out centuries ago and perfected it over generations. No computer calculations, no CAD software, just observation, trial and error, and accumulated wisdom passed from master to apprentice. Pure mechanical poetry, and it was about to become extinct. Now let's talk about the people who actually worked in these mills, because the machinery might have been elegant, but the human reality was brutal. 11-hour shifts, 6 days a week, for $1.50 a day. And here's the catch, you often didn't even get cash. You got company scrip, vouchers redeemable only at the company store, where prices were, let's say, creative. A loaf of bread that cost 10 cents in town, 20 cents at the mill store. You were being robbed and there wasn't a damn thing you could do about it. The living conditions, imagine a wooden barracks building. Now cram 20 to 100 men inside. The roof leaks. The walls have gaps where winter wind screams through. There's no privacy whatsoever. In the coldest months, men slept 2 to a bunk just to survive the night. The smell alone would make you gag. Unwashed bodies, wet wool, wood smoke, and desperation all mixed together, and that was just where you slept. The real nightmare was the work itself. Picture the mill floor, massive saw blades whipping back and forth with nothing, absolutely nothing protecting you from them. Gears and belts spinning at head height with no guards, drive shafts rotating overhead, ready to catch loose clothing or hair, wooden catwalks slick with sawdust and water, no railings, positioned directly above the machinery. One slip and you're done. Lost fingers were common, so common they barely got mentioned. A man would show up to work with a hand wrapped in bloody rags, and everyone just nodded and kept working. Lost hands? That happened too. Lost lives, more often than anyone wanted to admit. Take Anders Eriksson, fictional name, real story. Norwegian immigrant, 28 years old, working the Sani and Soli mill in 1919. One bad morning, the saw bound in a knot, kicked the log, and took 3 of his fingers in a single shriek of steel. He wrapped his hand in rags and went back to work the next day. He had a wife and 2 small children in the camp, and no savings. 6 months later, a shifting log on the carriage crushed his leg. The company paid for a rough amputation and then fired him as unfit for duty. No pension, no compensation. He ended up begging in a port city, staring at ships loaded with lumber he'd once helped cut. That was the system. Men drowned in the mill ponds, got crushed between logs, fell into gear mechanisms, and were pulled in before anyone could hit the brake, if there even was a brake. Got struck by crane hooks swinging blind around corners. Were killed by kickback when a saw blade bound up in a knot and the log exploded backward like a battering ram. There were no safety regulations, no workers' compensation, no insurance. If you got hurt, you got fired. If you died, your family got nothing. Maybe the company would pay for a basic burial if they were feeling generous. Maybe. And here's what really twists the knife. The mill owners knew. Of course they knew. But this was the era of robber barons and industrial fortunes built on broken backs. Safety cost money. Dead workers were free. There was always another desperate man willing to take the job, because that's what these workers were, desperate. They came from everywhere, failed farmers from the Appalachians, immigrants fresh off the boat at Ellis Island, barely speaking English, former slaves and their descendants, escaping sharecropping only to find a different kind of bondage, young men from fishing villages where the cod had run out, all of them gambling their lives for poverty wages, because the alternative was starvation. The companies exploited this ruthlessly. They'd recruit workers, promise steady pay, then when men showed up with their families, there'd be delays or supply problems. No work today, maybe tomorrow. But you'd already invested everything to get there. You'd already bought provisions on credit from the company store. You were trapped. Some mills operated what workers called robber's airy, a system so predatory it had its own slang term. You'd work all week, then, on payday, you'd discover you actually owed the company money after they deducted room, board, equipment rental, and inflated store charges. You were literally working yourself into debt. Meanwhile, the mill owners, they were making fortunes. The 1920s saw explosive demand for lumber, post-war construction boom, new suburbs, the housing market on fire. A well-positioned watermill could process tens of thousands of board feet per day. The profit margins were obscene, so you had this grotesque contrast. Men dying for $1.50 while owners built mansions and bought motor cars. Workers sleeping in freezed-in barracks while management dined on steak. It was the Gilded Age stripped down to its ugliest essence, and the workers knew it. By the 1890s, unions started forming. The industrial workers of the world organized lumber workers. Strikes happened, though they were often crushed violently. Men fought back the only way they could, with solidarity, work stoppages, and occasionally the sabotage. But the real change, the change that would actually save lives and end the exploitation, wasn't going to come from labor organizing. It was going to come from something the workers couldn't have predicted. Technology was about to make the whole system obsolete. And when it did, these dangerous, brutal jobs would vanish along with the mills themselves. Progress doesn't care about human cost. It just moves. Let's dig deeper into this system, because the exploitation went beyond just dangerous work and low pay. It was structured oppression, carefully designed to keep workers powerless. Here's how it worked. You'd sign on with a lumber company, and they'd tell you the camp was just a short walk from the mill. So you'd pack your gear, your saw, your axe, spare boots, bedroll, maybe 25 kilograms of equipment, and start walking. Except it wasn't a short walk. It was 5 kilometers, 10, sometimes more. And when you finally arrived, exhausted, there might not even be work available. Check back tomorrow, they'd say. So you'd paid for lodging you couldn't afford, in a place you couldn't leave, waiting for work that might never materialize. The payment system was deliberately designed to trap you. Wages came irregularly, sometimes weekly, often monthly, occasionally not at all if the company claimed cash flow problems. And remember, it usually wasn't real money, company scrip, worthless anywhere except the company store. But you needed food, tools, clothing, medicine when you got sick, which happened constantly in those filthy barracks. So you'd buy on credit. The company kept a ledger. They charged interest, ridiculous interest rates that would make a loan shark blush. Workers had a name for it, robber's airy. Robbery disguised as commerce. You'd work yourself half to death for months and somehow end up, deeper in debt than when you started. It was designed that way. Debt bondage with a friendly face. And if you complained, if you spoke up about conditions, or tried to organize your fellow workers, you were blacklisted, not just fired, blacklisted across the entire region. Mill owners shared information. One troublemaker gets marked, and suddenly he can't find work anywhere. His family starves. Message received. But something was shifting. By the 1890s, workers started realizing that isolated complaints got crushed, but collective action had power. The first lumber workers' unions emerged, rough, militant organizations born in camps and mill towns. The industrial workers of the world, the Wobblies, made serious inroads in the Pacific Northwest. The American Federation of Labor organized mill workers in the Northeast. These weren't polite negotiations over tea. This was class warfare. Strikes turned violent. Company guards, basically armed thugs, would attack picket lines. State militias got called in to break strikes. Workers fought back with sabotage, work slowdowns, and sheer determination. Some victories happened. A few mills agreed to basic safety measures. Some improved housing conditions. A handful even started paying in actual currency. But these were exceptions, hard-won through blood and sacrifice. The real story, though, was the scale of human migration this industry drove. Tens of thousands of people in motion, chasing rumors of work. You had families abandoning Appalachian farms where the soil had given out. You had waves of European immigrants, Scandinavians, Finns, Poles, Italians, arriving at Ellis Island and immediately heading to lumber camps because it was one of the few industries that would hire them with no English and no connections. You had African Americans fleeing the Jim Crow South, hoping that northern lumber camps might offer something better than sharecropping. Spoiler, it wasn't much better, but at least they weren't living under explicit apartheid. Former slaves working alongside Swedish immigrants, alongside failed shopkeepers from New York, all equally exploited, all equally expendable. The lumber camps became these strange melting pots of desperation. Different languages, different backgrounds, all unified by poverty and dangerous work. Some solidarity emerged from that. Workers learned they had more in common with each other than with the bosses, regardless of where they came from. But the owners understood this too. They deliberately stoked ethnic tensions when they could. Put different nationalities in different barracks. Spread rumors about one group stealing jobs from another. Pay Italian workers slightly less than Swedish workers and watch the resentment build. Classic divide and conquer. Still, the unions persisted. Strike by strike, negotiation by negotiation, they won small concessions. By the 1910s and 1920s, conditions in some camps had genuinely improved. Not great, still dangerous, still hard, but measurably better than the nightmare of the 1880s and 1890s. And then, just as workers were starting to gain some leverage, just as unions were becoming powerful enough to force real change, the entire industry transformed. Not because of worker organizing, not because owners suddenly developed consciences, because electricity arrived, and electricity didn't care about labor disputes or safety regulations or company scrip. Electricity just made water wheels obsolete. The very thing workers had been fighting to improve was about to disappear completely. Every job, every union, every hard-won concession, gone. Progress doesn't negotiate. The warning signs were there decades before the final collapse. People just didn't want to see them. By 1900, water power was already losing the war. Look at the numbers. Only 15% of industrial energy in the United States came from water. 15%. Steam engines and early electric motors had already captured the rest. The water-powered lumber mill, this technology that had dominated for centuries, was clinging to life in an increasingly electrified world. But here's the thing that kept them alive longer than you'd expect. Water wheels were actually incredibly efficient. The best turbine designs, like the Leffel turbines that some mills installed, achieved 90% efficiency. 90%. That's genuinely remarkable. Early steam engines couldn't touch that. They chugged coal, belched smoke, and converted maybe 20 to 30% of their fuel energy into actual work. So why didn't water power win? Because efficiency isn't everything. Location matters. Reliability matters. Flexibility matters. A water-powered mill needed a river with consistent flow and sufficient drop height. That's not negotiable. You can't build a water mill in a flat prairie or a desert, no matter how much lumber you need to process there. You're geographically imprisoned. And if the river freezes in winter, you shut down. If there's a drought in summer, you shut down. If there's a flood that damages your wheel or dam, you shut down and spend weeks repairing. Steam and electric power, they didn't care about geography or weather. Build your mill wherever makes economic sense. Run it 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. The lumber comes to you by rail. The power comes from coal or electricity. You're free. The hydroelectric revolution accelerated this. By 1920, electrical grids were spreading like spider webs across North America and Europe. And here's a fascinating data point. Mills located within 70 kilometers of a hydroelectric power station showed a 10% productivity increase in energy-intensive operations compared to mills farther away. 10% doesn't sound dramatic until you realize that's the difference between profit and bankruptcy. Electricity changed everything about scale, too. In 1922, Oregon saw the construction of the first truly modern industrial lumber mill. Massive concrete and steel structure, cost $1.5 million. To put that in perspective, that's about 25 million in today's money. It was a cathedral of industry, a skyscraper compared to the humble wooden water mills. Inside this new mill, electric motors drove dozens of saws simultaneously. Conveyor systems moved lumber automatically. Lighting meant work could continue after dark. Climate control meant year-round operation. The productivity difference wasn't incremental, it was exponential. One electric mill could outproduce 10 water mills, maybe 20. And the speed, my God, the speed. A water-powered saw might take 30 minutes to process a large log into boards. An electric mill could do it in 1 minute, 30 times faster. That's not an improvement. That's a different universe. The economic logic became inescapable. Yes, building an electric mill required enormous capital investment. But once operational, the cost per board foot dropped through the floor. Labor costs fell because you needed fewer workers. Processing time plummeted. You could take contracts that water mills couldn't even attempt. But there's another factor nobody talks about much: centralization. Water mills had to be scattered wherever rivers provided power. This meant the lumber industry was geographically dispersed, with small mills spread across forested regions. Each mill operated semi-independently, serving local markets. Electricity broke that pattern. Now you could build one enormous mill in an optimal location, close to rail networks, near ports, in towns with available labor. Logs from hundreds of miles away arrived by train. Finished lumber shipped out the same way. The entire industry consolidated into fewer, larger, more efficient operations. This was capitalism, doing what capitalism does: concentrating capital, eliminating redundancy, maximizing profit. The small water mills scattered across New England and Scandinavia couldn't compete. They weren't just slower, they were economically obsolete. By the mid-1920s, the writing wasn't just on the wall, it was in neon lights. Industry publications ran articles about modernization and electrification. Trade shows featured the latest electric sawmill equipment. Forward-thinking mill owners started converting their operations or selling out to larger corporations. The traditional mill operators saw it happening. The old Norwegian mill masters, the main lumber families who'd run water mills for generations, they knew. Some tried to adapt, installing electric motors alongside their water wheels as a hedge. Some borrowed heavily to build modern facilities. Some just held on, hoping the old ways would somehow survive. They wouldn't. The dam was breaking, and the flood of progress was about to sweep away everything these people had built. Every skill they'd mastered, every tradition they'd maintained, every community that existed because of a water-powered mill. The 1920s would be both the final boom and the beginning of the end. One last golden age before extinction. The 1920s hit like a fever dream. World War I had ended. Soldiers came home. The economy roared. And suddenly, everyone wanted to build. Houses, factories, towns, entire suburbs sprawling outward from city centers. The demand for lumber went absolutely crazy. For the water-powered mills, this should have been salvation. This was their moment. Prices soared. Orders flooded in. Every mill that could still operate ran at maximum capacity. The wheels spun day and night. Workers pulled double shifts. Money flowed like it hadn't in decades. It was a boom, a genuine, glorious boom. And it was the swan song. Because while the old mills were busy trying to keep up with demand, the new electric mills were being built at a terrifying pace. And they weren't just keeping up, they were dominating. A single new electric facility could outproduce a dozen traditional mills. The math was brutal and simple. Let's look at one specific example: the Sana and Soli mill in Norway. This wasn't some backwoods operation. This was the largest water-powered lumber mill in Northern Europe. 22 saw blades running simultaneously, 600 workers, a massive complex that had operated for generations. It was profitable. It was efficient. By watermill standards, it was perfect. And by the end of the 1920s, it was closed, shut down, abandoned. Why? because a new electric mill 40 kilometers away could do the same work with 100 workers and process lumber 3 times faster. The owners looked at the numbers and realized they were managing a relic. A profitable relic, sure, but one with no future. Better to sell the land, liquidate the equipment, and invest in modern facilities than watch their empire slowly become worthless. Old Johan Lindström had run the wheelhouse at Sane and Soli for 32 years. His father taught him the trade. His grandfather helped carve the original oak gears by hand. On the final day in 1929, Johan stood in the empty mill, watching the great wheel come to rest for the last time. Water still pouring uselessly past the motionless buckets. He was 56. Too old to retrain for electric mills. Too skilled to call himself useless, but his skill was now a museum piece. He moved to Bergen, took odd jobs he was overqualified for, and died 5 years later, bitter, broke, in a cramped city apartment where you couldn't even hear running water. This pattern repeated across the industrial world. In Maine, mills that had operated since the 1840s went silent. In Oregon, entire lumber towns built around water. Power saw their populations collapse as workers left for electric mill jobs. In Sweden, Germany, Scotland, everywhere, the story was the same. The speed of the collapse shocked everyone. In 1920, thousands of water-powered mills still operated. By 1930, most were gone. A decade. That's all it took to erase centuries of tradition. And this wasn't just about economics. Think about what was being lost. The master millwrights who understood water flow and gear ratios through decades of experience, suddenly their knowledge was worthless. The families who'd run the same mill for 4 generations, their inheritance vanished. The towns that existed purely because of a mill's location on a river, they died or transformed into something unrecognizable. Entire communities faced existential crisis. What do you do when the single industry that supports your town becomes obsolete? Some people adapted. They moved to cities. They found work in the new electric mills, though it meant starting over at the bottom. They learned new trades, but many couldn't or wouldn't adapt. Older workers especially, men in their 50s who'd spent their entire lives mastering water-powered lumber production. They watched their skills become museum pieces in real time. Some mills tried to hold on, undercutting prices, operating on razor-thin margins. It didn't matter. They were competing against an exponentially superior technology. The geography of the industry itself shifted. Rivers that had been crucial transportation and power arteries became irrelevant. The new electric mills clustered around rail hubs and ports. The old mill sites, many in remote areas chosen specifically for water power, were simply abandoned. Buildings left to rot. Wheels seized up from rust. Dams slowly crumbled. And here's the cruel irony. Many of these old mills were still functional when they closed. They could still saw lumber. The machinery still worked. In a pure mechanical sense, they weren't broken. They were just slow, inflexible, bound to rivers that sometimes froze or ran low, against electric mills that ran constantly, in any weather, at any location, processing lumber at speeds that would have seemed like science fiction just 20 years earlier. There was simply no contest. The workers felt it most acutely. All those decades of fighting for better conditions, organizing unions, winning concessions from owners, and now, the jobs were disappearing entirely. You couldn't strike against technological obsolescence. You couldn't negotiate with progress. Some workers transitioned to the new mills, but electric mills needed fewer people, much fewer. The automation, the conveyor systems, the electric motors, they replaced human labor on a massive scale. For every 10 men who lost jobs at water mills, maybe 3 found work at electric facilities. The rest, they scattered. Became farm hands, factory workers, whatever they could find. Picture the final day at one of these mills, the last log processed. The wheel stopping for the final time. Workers collecting their last pay and walking away. The owner, maybe his grandfather built this mill, locking the door. the buildings standing empty as seasons pass, snow accumulating on the roof, windows breaking, machinery rusting, vines growing up through floorboards. In 10 years, it would be unrecognizable. In 50, it might be completely gone, rotted away, or demolished, or buried under a reservoir, as if it never existed. The water age of lumber production didn't end with a bang. No dramatic final battle, no last stand. It just faded. Wheels stopped turning, workers stopped coming, buildings emptied, and the forests kept growing, indifferent to human industry and its revolutions. By 1935, water-powered lumber mills had become historical curiosities. By 1945, they were almost extinct. The transformation was complete. An entire way of life, gone in a generation. So what's left? What survived the Great Extinction? More than you might think, actually. Because even as the mainstream lumber industry electrified, some mills held on in the margins. Not out of nostalgia or stubbornness, though there was plenty of both, but out of pure geographic necessity. Remote regions where electricity arrived late, if at all. Mountain valleys in Norway, where running power lines wasn't economically viable until the 1950s. Isolated communities in northern Maine and the Pacific Northwest, where the grid simply hadn't reached. In these places, water mills kept operating decades after they'd vanished everywhere else. Take the Tria region of Norway. Water-powered sawmills there ran into the 1960s, not as museum pieces or tourist attractions, as actual working businesses. They produced lumber for local construction, processed timber for export when they could, and maintained the old traditions because they had no choice. These were the last holdouts, the final living examples of a dying art. And then, one by one, even they succumbed. Electricity finally arrived. Owners retired without successors willing to learn the craft. Economic pressure made continued operation impossible. By the 1970s, functional water-powered lumber mills had essentially ceased to exist as commercial enterprises. But something interesting happened. Just as the last working mills were shutting down, people started realizing what was being lost. Industrial archaeology was becoming a thing. Living history museums, heritage preservation, the idea that maybe, just maybe, we should save a few examples of these incredible machines before they all rotted into the ground. A handful of mills were restored. Hope Mill became a living history site, where visitors can watch the entire process, water wheel turning, gears engaging, saw blade cutting through wood exactly as it did a century ago. Aurfjord Saga in Norway was reconstructed and now operates seasonally, demonstrating the forgotten skills of water-powered lumber production. These restored mills are fascinating time capsules. When you stand inside one while it's running, you're experiencing something that billions of people throughout history knew intimately, but that almost no one alive today has witnessed. The smell of fresh sawdust, the rhythmic sound of blade cutting wood, the mechanical symphony of wooden gears and iron shafts. The patient, steady power of falling water doing work. It connects you to a different relationship with energy and labor. These mills operated at the speed of nature, the speed of water flowing, of wood growing, of seasons changing. There was no rushing, no shortcutting. You worked with what the river gave you. And here's where the story gets weird. That obsolete technology, it's having a renaissance. Small-scale hydropower, micro-hydro generation, has become trendy in the 2020s. Off-grid homesteaders, eco-villages, remote lodges, they're installing miniature water wheels and turbines to generate electricity sustainably. It's the same principle that powered those lumber mills, just applied differently. The wheel of history, turning back on itself. What was cutting edge in 1700, obsolete by 1930, is somehow relevant again in 2025. Because it turns out that technology which harnesses gravity and moving water without fossil fuels or complex supply chains has value in a world thinking about sustainability and resilience. There's a philosophical question buried in this entire story. Did we gain more than we lost? Obviously, yes, right? Electric mills are faster, safer, more productive. They freed workers from brutal conditions. They allowed the lumber industry to scale and meet modern demand. They enabled the construction of the world we live in today, the houses, the buildings, the infrastructure. But we also lost something. We lost the autonomy of local production. Those water mills were decentralized, scattered across landscapes wherever rivers ran. Communities could process their own lumber without depending on distant corporations or electrical grids. If the power grid collapsed tomorrow, those old mills could still operate. The new ones, dead in seconds. We lost the connection to natural rhythms. Water mills operated within the constraints of their environment. Seasonal flows, weather patterns, sustainable harvest rates. They couldn't overexploit resources because they were physically limited by the power available. Electric mills have no such constraints. Clear-cut entire forests in months, if the economics work. We lost accumulated knowledge. The master millwrights who understood timber and water and machinery through decades of hands-on experience. That knowledge died with them. Sure, we have some documentation, some restored mills, some academic studies, but the lived expertise, the intuitive understanding that comes from a lifetime of practice, that's gone. And we lost a certain kind of beauty, the elegance of purely mechanical systems, the satisfaction of watching falling water transform into rotating motion, into cutting force. No electronics, no computers, just physics and craftsmanship working in harmony. Progress always involves trade-offs. We gained speed and scale and safety. We lost independence and sustainability and tradition. Whether that was a good trade depends on your values and your vision of what technology should serve. But here's what we can say with certainty. For roughly 2 centuries, water-powered lumber mills were the beating heart of industrial forestry. They shaped economies, built communities, and turned raw forests into the material infrastructure of civilization. Millions of people lived their entire lives around these machines. The lumber that built America, built Europe, built the modern world. Much of it passed through water-powered saws, and then, in less than a generation, they vanished, replaced by something faster, cheaper, more efficient. Progress didn't pause to mourn what was lost. It just moved. Those restored mills stand now as monuments to a vanished world. Visit one if you ever get the chance. Watch the wheel turn. Hear the saw bite into wood. Feel the vibration through the floorboards. And remember that what seems permanent and powerful and eternal, industries, technologies, entire ways of life, can disappear so quickly, it's almost like they were never there at all. The river keeps flowing, the wheel, mostly, stays still. That's how empires end. Not with thunder, but with silence.